Hello, everyone. We are back and ready to go with today's webinar on Category 9 of the CSBG Organizational Standards, Data and Analysis. And with that, I'm going to let Jarl Crocker take it away.
Great. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm Jarl Crocker. I'm Director of Training and Technical Assistance here at the Partnership, and we're also joined this afternoon by Barbara Mooney. And Barbara, I will hand it over to you just to do a quick introduction for yourself.
Hi, thanks, Jarl. So good to be with you all talking about my favorite topics, data and analysis, and I hope we'll have a good session today. If you have questions, we'll be glad to hear them, and suggestions, we'll be glad to hear them as well.
Great, thank you, Barbara. And so I'll start us off with an overview of the Technical Assistance Guide, how it's organized, its primary purpose, and then I'll turn it over to Barbara to talk about the content and join her for any questions and answers that folks on the line may have. So to begin, we'll talk about the overview of the Technical Assistance Guide. All our guides are relatively consistent in terms of how they're organized and how we present the content. We begin the guide with a discussion and some guidance on how agencies might want to go about organizing the review process to determine if they're in compliance with the standards. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then I'll turn it over to Barbara to discuss standards 9.1 through 9.4, and we'll wrap it up with any questions. But as on most of our webinars, you can feel more than free to ask questions as we go through the standards. We'll make sure to pause at the end of each standard to ask, so you can ask questions specifically on them. And again, feel more than free to chime in with a question any other time. So a brief overview of the Technical Assistance Guide structure. So there are two primary purposes for these Technical Assistance Guides. The first and primary purpose is to help agencies and assist with the definition, intent, and documentation of the standards. So for each of the standards reviewed in the guide, you will see 4 different sections. The first 2 sections refer to definition, intent, and documentation. So what you'll read in Section A is a brief overview of the standard. We provide some additional context, any background on the standard, defining any technical terms, explaining any technical information about how it's used, management and operation systems that are related to the standards, and also a quick explanation of why the standard was included in the overall set of organizational standards, because we think it's important for us as a network to know why each of the standards were selected. Section B, you'll see background on the interpretation of compliance. So what we've tried to do is anticipate questions agencies might have about particular situations that come up, about whether they're in compliance with the standard. This is based on just our own thinking and feedback we've gotten from agencies. So again, we're trying to provide some general guidance here. And then we also provide suggestions for specific documentation that agencies should be able to use to show that they are in compliance with the standard. Of course, the important caveat is that ultimately it's your state CSBG lead agency that will define how the standard is interpreted for each state and the documentation that you will need to show that you are in compliance. But again, we're pretty sure that most of this guidance will be a helpful, quick start for our agencies as they begin to go through that the first annual process of determining whether they are in compliance with the standards. Now, the second purpose and objective of these Technical Assistance Guides is to provide some capacity building support to our agencies, and especially support in going beyond compliance. And so what we suggest is that as agencies go through the process to review compliance with the standards, they also take a little bit of extra time for the individual or the team who's going through that review process to think about not just whether the agency is in compliance with the standard, but how well they're doing. And so we provide some additional resources to help with that process. So in Section C, what you'll find for all of the standards is a short series of diagnostic questions that you can use for discussion or just to help your own internal thinking about how well the agency is doing. And then in Section D, we provide you with a brief list of resources to help you do that diagnostic assessment but also their general capacity building resources around the activities, the management and operations related to the standard. And again, this is a purely voluntary process. It is not required as part of the organizational standard that you go beyond compliance and do that assessment. But again, we strongly suggest that our agencies think about going through that process simply because if you're going to go through the assessment process in the first place to see if you're in compliance with the standards, we just think it makes good sense to take an extra 30, 45 minutes for each of them, again, to ask how well your agency is doing and especially make some recommendations about how the agency might improve once you've gone through those diagnostic questions or read a few of those resources. So again, quick list of standards in Category 9 that we've got up there. They again, these are standards around data. So Standard 9.1, the organization or department has a system or systems in place to track and report client demographics and services customers receive. Standard 9.2, the organization or department, depending on if you're public or private, has a system or systems in place to track family, agency, or community outcomes. Standard 9.3, the organization or department has presented to the governing board or advisory body for review or action, at least within the past 12 months, an analysis of the agency's outcomes and any operational or strategic program adjustments and improvements identified as necessary. And Standard 9.4, the organization or department submits its annual CSBG information survey data report, and it reflects client demographics and organization-wide or CSBG-funded outcomes. Now, again, as you can see in the language, we're addressing both public and private CAPs. It's important to note that we will be coming out with a separate set of guides for our public agencies just as soon as we finish the guides for the private agencies, but we think all of our public agencies can benefit from these webinars and from reading the guides for the private agencies because most of the information is applicable to either type of agency. So Category 9, data and analysis. We begin each technical assistance guide, again, with some basic guidance on the process that agencies might use in order to review whether they're in compliance with the standard. So we ask that each of our agencies just ask some basic diagnostic questions before they begin the process, just to make sure all their ducks are in a row. Now, we anticipate some agencies, especially smaller ones, might task a single individual with the process of going through and gathering that documentation, but we're guessing that most agencies will probably have teams of staff working on the compliance process. And so it's especially important to make sure those efforts are coordinated. So again, these diagnostic questions are simply to help agencies think through that process before it begins to make sure it's conducted as efficiently as possible. So we ask the agency to ask how the review for Category 9 is connected to processes to document the other standards. So again, making sure if there are multiple review processes going on at the same time, they're coordinating their efforts. The folks who are doing those reviews are talking to each other, again, so you have as seamless a review process as possible. We also suggest that agencies look for opportunities to connect the review into existing agency processes. So, for example, if you are in the process of uploading your IS report, that might be a good time to go through and gather documentation for these standards. So again, being strategic and looking for those opportunities where you're already going to be doing work that are related to the standards, so you can hopefully fold that assessment process into those activities to just make it a little bit more efficient. We also ask that agencies should think about who should participate. Again, for some of the standards, we're guessing that an agency might simply assign one person, but we're suggesting that agencies think about using a team-based approach. Going through the documentation process is a good way to train new staff. It's a good way to potentially cross-train staff. And also, it's just simply a good exercise for a couple of different staff to look at how the agency conducts the process, because it might not always be the same person who's the primary reviewer or documenter for the process of showing that you're in compliance with the standard. So generally good practice to have a couple different staff who have gone through the process if someone leaves or for whatever reason you're using a different person the next time around. We're also suggesting that agencies make sure that the staff who are involved in that review process are on the same page about how the standards are met. So it's probably helpful to hold a meeting to answer questions about how you do that interpretation process, hopefully review any guidance or direction from your state lead agency about interpretation of the standards. So just making sure that the folks who are doing the review are all on the same page about how the process works. We're also suggesting that you do the same thing for how staff document compliance with the standards. So this is making sure, things like making sure that there's a common filing system in use, staff are using consistent documentation procedures, you're saving the documents in the same place, everybody knows how to use a central filing system. So again, making sure that you're conducting that review as effectively and efficiently as possible, especially if you're using multiple staff. We also suggest that agencies think about how they manage recommendations. So again, we're asking that for each of the standards, the staff who are doing that review process, again, take a little extra time to make some suggestions about how the agency might improve the way it's working in relation to whatever activities are covered by the standards. Again, that's what those sections C and D are for, those diagnostic questions and those resources. But since you're already going through the review process, we strongly suggest that you take that extra time to think about some recommendations to improve how the agency is working around whatever activities are covered by the standards, simply because it's good practice, it's consistent with the ROMA cycle, and it's a way to make sure that you're constantly thinking about how to improve your work as an agency. And lastly, we suggest that the staff think about how they archive results and make sure that all the staff who are involved in the review process are archiving those documents in the same way. We strongly suggest those documents are saved in a central location. We've seen some agencies begin to use iPads, so they simply scan or copy and upload all the documentation to the iPad. So all that documentation is in the same place. It's very easy to access by a monitor. It makes your life a lot easier in the out years when you go through this process again, because you don't have to hunt down files. But we've also seen agencies use a more old school approach, simply keeping all the files in a filing cabinet with one binder or file folder that lists all the standards with all the documentation associated with each of those standards. Again, just so you're filing all those documents in the same place, and more importantly, making sure all the staff who are going through that review process are familiar with how you archive the results. And we also suggest that you do a quick manual or notes for the staff who will do this process in the out years, because again, it might not always be the same set of staff. So it's good just to have, a one-page guidance on how the process worked the last time, and any notes for staff who might do that process in the future. We also provide a few quick suggestions for how to do that evaluation or assessment process to make those recommendations to the agency. A couple of basic suggestions for how that process might work would simply be to have the staff, once they've gathered the documentation, review those diagnostic questions that are in section C for each standard, potentially review some of the resources, and simply discuss the strengths and opportunities for improvement for the agency around those activities related to the standard. Another option would be to do a deeper dive in some of the resource materials. Again, those resource materials often include case studies, examples of best practices, overviews of sort of standard approaches to doing things like data collection. So again, they're a great way to compare your agency to how other agencies are conducting themselves against best practices from other agencies, and again, that helps the process of making those recommendations. Another more involved option would be to interview some key staff or conduct a focus group to get feedback for the agency about how it can improve its work. And then at the sort of far end of the spectrum, you might do that with your external partners who you work with on data collection, or who would be able to provide you with some feedback on how your data systems work. So again, a couple of different options. We know that going through the review process and simply gathering the documentation will take a fair amount of time, but again, we're suggesting that agencies spend at least a short period of time thinking through how they're doing overall, and then making those recommendations. And at the end of every technical assistance guide, we provide a grid with a Likert scale, and we suggest that agencies rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5 to help get a quick sense of how they're doing, again, related to the standard. That's not a mandatory exercise. You don't have to do that when you go through the standards. But again, it's a good way to benchmark how your agency is doing, make sure that future efforts for documenting and reviewing the standard can look at how you're doing, follow those notes, and again, hopefully make a continued series of recommendations about how your agency can improve. So again, just a good standard practice consistent with the Roma cycle and helpful for thinking about how agencies can constantly improve their performance, but again, not required by the standards. It's just our strong recommendation that you consider going through that process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara to talk a little bit more about the content of the standards.
Thanks, Charles. It's a good overview. We're going to now dive into the data collection processes. The idea of the understanding of the data collection system is that there will be different kinds of formats across the state. As Jarl said, these guides give some examples of documentation, but the way that the assessment is being done and collected and formatted may have different directions from across the state. So you need to understand that and always be checking with your state, who is the ultimate authority. But regardless of all those different formats, all of the information needs to come back together in a standardized way and relate back to the state plan and the annual report that is going to be interconnected. So the thing that I think is most dramatic about our movement in performance management system in OCS these days is that it's really connecting what's going on at the local level, the state level, and the national level, and this is a clear show of how that happens. So we're going to look at, I think I have the ability to do this, to move it forward. We're going to look at the first standard, and in the first standard, we're looking at two different kinds of things. This standard says that there's a system in place to both track client demographics and also services that customers receive. So when we talk about a tracking system, a system of tracking, we're really talking about a well-defined method of gathering and storing data. It could be electronic, and it doesn't have to be. So we're not talking software specifically here, but each agency will have to figure out how they might do this. And once you talk about electronic systems, they could be networked or accessed via the web, or as old school, as Jarl says, by putting things in folders. So the idea of having this system to track client demographics, it's what goes into the CSBG-IS report, the age, gender, education, those kinds of things. But it's whatever other kind of demographics that are required as part of your service system. So if you're working with veterans, or if you're working with individuals that have been incarcerated, you may have different elements of demographic data that you collect and that you track and that you understand, and those are part of your decision making. it's interesting in this one, and I know 1 million people looked at these standards before they got submitted, but you'll see that both the terms client and customer are included in this one sentence. So we're going to track and report client demographics and services that customers receive. So I think this is a good example of how community action is so all-encompassing that we're using both of the terms that are commonly used in the network. Do not let that bother you. We are talking about those people that are served by your agency. And your client or your customer may also be a community, and you might be thinking about that in some way. So the intent, the basic reasoning for this standard is to ensure that every agency has the ability to identify the number of people being served by the agency as a whole, to collect the information about these customers that tells you who they are, and then to identify the services that are provided. So there's no mention in this standard about the term unduplicated count. But as we know, if you read the NASPAP-IS information, the instruction guide for completing the IS survey, you will find a detailed description about the unduplicated count that is expected to be included in that report. But it's important really to be able to identify not only the demographics, but also to be able to compare those demographics with the services. Part of what we're looking at moving forward is to be able to compare the demographics with the services to find out who has received what service. And then to really know how much service that was being given. What's the percent of the total number of families that received a single service? What was that service? Does this population that received that service have any commonalities, common characteristics that might help the agency understand why that particular service was being requested? And so there's a series of ideas that are encompassed in this short definition, but it's key that we have this comprehensive data collection system. And not only that it's in place, but that it's also in use, that that once you document that you have this system, you need to also be able to document that it's being used. And so how do you do that? Here are some ideas. I'm sure there's other ideas that you have, and we'd be glad to hear them, but either electronic or hard copy of the forms that are used to collect data. That would be one way of showing that you have a system. You show the intake, documentation, and then you show the satisfaction surveys, which shows that you're able to collect data about the services on many levels. You could show a screenshot. You could document the policies that are related to data collection. Your agency may have specific information systems policies that are in place. And there may be job descriptions that include how data is recorded, collected and recorded. And so a couple of questions that come up when you think about this standard is this idea of who are you counting? So let's assume that you have an appropriate system for collecting demographics. About whom are you collecting those demographics? When does a client become a client? Is it that when a person makes the first application for service, or is it after the first service is provided? Are people who call in, say, for information and referral information, are those folks clients yet? So that's a question that has to precede the tracking and reporting of the data. And then the real issue here is a thought about how the differing systems that agencies have can be unified into an agency-wide tracking and reporting system, and that's pretty much that's a pretty big deal to think about. That's a big question, and we need to really work on that as you work through documenting compliance with this standard. The challenges and the successes that you have should also be documented. The last piece of this, well, not the last piece, but PC, is about beyond compliance. Do we want to talk about questions? I think there are a couple of questions, but do we want to do questions first and then go to beyond compliance, or go to beyond compliance?
You know, since the questions are about compliance with the standard, let's take those questions right now, and then Barbara, we can move back into talking about the beyond compliance. So
Perfect.
We've got a couple of questions from the audience. Cashin, do we have the first question up there? Does the system to track demographics in 9.1 extend to program participants not directly funded by CSBG funds?
Well, I will refer to the NASCASP-IS information instructions, which says that it's the intent that all clients of the agency be reported.
Right, and now, Cashin, a quick clarification, is that also true for public agencies?
And that is where you kind of get into an odd territory here. That is always the intent, and as Barbara said, that is what your IS says. We did try to kind of build in, I guess, I wouldn't call it an out, but I would say some flexibility for the public agencies throughout, throughout the standards in general, but especially here in Category 9, because it kind of depends how CSBG is integrated into your public government, your systems there. If you are just kind of overseeing these one or two programs, great, yes, include as much as you possibly can. If you are the 0.25% of the entire Department of Health and Human Services, that may not even be feasible, and you may need to narrow your focus to the CSBG. So I would say there is some flexibility for the public, and to try to basically think of it as whatever is feasible, do as much as feasible to be able to do.
Right, so again, another way to think about it is a private CAP that gets, obviously gets CSBG money should, at least in theory, have control over all of its different programs. If you're in a public agency and you are within a department or an office and are only getting, you know, that one slice of CSBG money, you don't have control in most cases over what people, you know, in the next office over, in the next department over are doing. So it's more, you have more limitations placed on you. Again, I think that's why it's very important to stress why if you have questions like this, you should reach out to your state CSBG lead agency to ask for clarification, because again, this is one of those complicated standards that's probably going to get some different interpretations across states. So making sure that your state lead agency has given you a clear answer before you're being monitored, I think is very, very important. They should at this point, since their model plans were due a week ago, they should be able to give you an answer to that question, but we are encouraging all our agencies on these more complicated questions to be proactive. Don't wait until you're monitored. Reach out directly to your lead agency, and they should hopefully be able to answer that question. We also have another question. How does this work, 9.1, with subcontractors that serve customers with CSBG funds? The public entity is the eligible entity in that case. And Barbara, anything to add before Cashin and I jump in?
No, go ahead. I'll clean up at the end.
Okay. So again, I think it's a similar answer to the previous one, if at all possible. Your subcontractors, if you are a public CAP, should be collecting that data, so it might be something that you work into your MOU or your contract with them. But again, in some cases, it might simply not be possible. Cash, any additional clarifications?
Well, yeah, I think that's true. It's that kind of feasibility test, and it really depends on those public agencies. I think that's my answer to all of them that have public agency questions. It depends. But if you aren't really doing any direct service whatsoever as the public entity, if you're basically subcontracting it all out, I would say, yeah, you would probably need to do this. Otherwise, you literally have no information. That said, officially speaking, this is for the eligible entities. You don't have to pass down all standards to any subcontractors. But like I said, I'd say there was an exception if you, in fact, subcontracted out all direct service.
Right, and again, this is another example of a question that you should probably reach out to your state CSBG lead agency. It might be a situation where your subcontractors have not been collecting that data, but you could ask them to collect that data in year 2 of assessment against the standards, but you simply wouldn't have that for this current year. So you might be able to arrange an MOU or a waiver for this particular standard if you're a public agency, but again, would stress the importance of making sure you reach out directly to your state lead agency in this particular case to get a clarification of what their expectations are, and you can potentially negotiate around those types of issues. Again, important to do this probably before the monitoring process begins, especially on some of these standards that might require action by your subcontractors that you don't necessarily have immediate direct control over.
My apologies to Colorado. That is where that question comes from, and I know you guys have a lot to work through because you have a lot of those it depends. I don't envy you.
Great, so unless there are any other questions on compliance with 9.1?
Not at this point. There's another one that I think we'll circle back to in a standard or two, though.
Okay, great. So Barbara, continue about beyond compliance.
Okay, just a couple comments on that discussion. I think that the intent of this standard is that if CSBG dollars are used by a public entity, that the department that is using those CSBG dollars should track their demographics and the services. And the reason it's not organization-wide is that you'd be looking at county government or government in general, and that is it's an unreasonable request. So I think that Jarl's comment that you check with your state office is really the bottom line on that discussion, is that what does your state ask you to do specifically, but remember that the intent of the standards is to make sure that we're getting national data that's comprehensive. Okay, beyond compliance. So here's the big question, and you'll see this question again in 9.2. There is absolutely nowhere that we see that the data that's collected in standard 9.1 is aggregated with the data that's collected in 9.2, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I want to raise the issue that this is one of the intents of this standard, is that the information can be aggregated. So can the people and services tracked in this standard be related to the outcomes in the next standard? So that's a key piece, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the question then about analysis of data and how often it's analyzed, which we'll also come to in 9.3, but who analyzes the data? How is the data used? And then can you look at the services and the demographic data and then look back at your community needs assessment data and say, the population that we serve is matching the population who identified that they had needs. Are you, does what you're doing match what your community needs assessment indicated? And the same with the service level. Are your services addressing the highest priority needs? And then this whole idea of community as a client. We think of this as family tracking, but it doesn't say that. It says the client, and if your client is the community, how do you track that community level process? Any thoughts or questions on that? I didn't see anything come in, Cashin.
Nope, haven't seen anything yet.
Okay, so the two documents that I thought were most important as a resource for this standard are the instructions for the IS report and the lexicon. And we do have the idea of, we have them here too. So we do have an idea that we would like to see additional resources. So if you have other resources, you can let us know. So moving on to 9.2, how much time do we have? Are we till 3?
We actually have all the way till 3:30 Eastern Time.
Okay, good. All right, I don't have to speed up my talking then. So in 9.2, the organization or document has a system in place to track the outcomes, the family, the agency, and the community outcomes. So this is about tracking and reporting on all 3 levels of the national goals. And what the intent of this is to ensure that the agency has the ability to identify those outcomes. And so we look at it in these 3 ways that track the individual and families receiving the services from the intake till they have achieved the outcome. So that's important to consider. Keep that in mind as we move on here. That the agency is assisting in the production of outcomes for communities. The standard specifically speaks to outcomes achieved at the community level. And can each agency track its contribution to these outcomes? And then just on the agency level, are the agency outcomes tracked? Now, they're generally not tracked in the client tracking system, but how are they tracked and what does that system look like? So, and remember that the intent of this standard is to identify the outcomes that might be achieved by multiple services. So when we look back at 9.1 and we identify the services that people get, can we say what those services were that brought us to the outcome that gets measured in this standard? Let me see if I say it on the next slide here or not. Go forward. It's important that the network shows that there's so let me just go back here a second. So in this whole process of outcomes, particularly at the individual level, but at the community level as well, we know that people don't always achieve outcomes in a single year. So looking at your tracking system to say, can you show progress towards outcomes? And that's not required in this standard, but it's something to think about now, and we'll talk about it as we go beyond compliance. So the other piece of this is that there's a uniformity, a standardization across the country about identifying outcomes. Now, what does that mean? That has meant for the past 11 years, since 2004, when the national performance indicators were identified, that the standardized set of indicators and the standardized definition is encompassed in the national performance indicators, which are based on the 6 national Roma goals. And so that's been part of our system, and it is included in the standard because it talks about the intent to have a standardized set of outcomes. So the kinds of questions that you would, or the kinds of evidence that you would have, similar kind of evidence to that which we talked about in 9.1, but here we're also looking at reports and case notes and surveys, and then the identification of both baseline data and other document that shows progress. You can't show a change, which is what an outcome is. You can't show a change in status if you don't have a baseline from which to measure what has happened. So there's an implication in this standard that you have outcomes that are measured based on the initial status of the client, the customer, when they first came to see you. And again, screenshots and policies and job descriptions can be used to document compliance for this level. Some things to consider as you think about compliance and how to document it. How is progress tracked? And that includes this whole idea of what is done to make sure that the clients come back, that you're engaging them in multiple assessments. How is that done? What's the process for that? Can the agency integrate those different systems so that they can see outcomes that happen in one place, one service, get carried over so that you can see the bigger impact, the overall impact. And then what about the agency outcomes, which we just talked about, and then here's a good question to think about. How did the NPIs compare with performance indicators of other funding sources? Is that something that you can consider as you're reporting to those other funding sources? Can you include those outcomes if they don't fit directly in the NPIs on one of those blank lines? Okay, we're at the beyond compliance place. Did we have any questions about this one?
Sure, there's a couple that have come in. You had talked earlier, can you expound upon what it would mean for the community as a client?
Well, you know, we talk about community level change and what we're doing as community action. And so we sometimes will focus, we hear of like housing developments that are being done in a specific neighborhood. In that case, the neighborhood might be the customer, and the service that would be provided would be the building of new housing, and the outcome would be the access to high quality, low income or low cost housing. And you need to think about that as you're thinking about what your community level work entails. You need to step back and to say, who is this serving, and can we describe, can we include demographic data or geographical data as it would be for a community, but can we identify who is being served in the sense of the community level work?
And Barbara, we have another question. When public CAPs begin reporting family outcomes from all agency programs, do we only report outcomes from low-income CSBG eligible participants being served with non-CSBG funding sources, or all participants regardless of income or CSBG eligibility?
I would say to refer to the IS information instructions. It says, the sentence is, we want to hear about all of the clients that are served by CSBG. It doesn't say all the low-income clients, but so my interpretation of the language that's in that instruction is that it's all clients. Now, I remember in Pennsylvania we used to have a column that said all clients, and then one column that said low-income clients. I saw Bob Carterman was on the line. I don't know if you remember that, Bob, but so there was some idea that we did acknowledgement of the fact that we serve as a network, we serve people beyond the CSBG eligibility guidelines by the other funds that we get. and that's part of our work towards moving people towards self-sufficiency. But the way that I read the guidance, it's all clients.
Great, and I think that's all the questions on 9.2.
That's all we have at the moment.
All right, continue, Barbara.
Okay, so beyond compliance, and of course the first one is the same as the first one before. The idea that you are, you should be able to relate the outcomes with the demographics and the services. The other piece is to be able to think of how you're going to carry progress towards outcomes from one year to the next, because we know that people, the individuals for sure, but also communities, don't make changes in a 12-month period. And if you've got people that are moving forward, they're making progress towards self-sufficiency or towards their goals, but they haven't gotten there yet, we need to have a way of tracking that. And as differentiated from those people who've dropped out. So if you have 100 people that started in a program and 10 of them have achieved the outcome in the first year, how many of those are still progressing and how many of those have dropped out altogether? I mean, it's that kind of tracking that will help you to create more understanding of your outcomes going forward. And then how often is the outcome data analyzed? Is it once a year? I mean, in 9.3, you'll see that we're talking about at least on a 12-month basis, but in terms of really looking at outcomes, do you need to look at them more frequently? And then is this analysis used to produce a report, and who's involved in that? We'll see more of that in 9.3 here in a minute. And then again, the comparison of the outcome data that's actually achieved with the community needs assessment data to see if the outcomes that are achieved are actually matching the identified needs. And again, the references here, the resources are really the NASCAS information on the IS. And we'd be glad to have more information if you had any good ideas on that. So now this category is about, it's called data and analysis. But this is the only one of the 3 standards that talks about analysis. And as we move forward and we look at beyond compliance, or even as we think of compliance, the concepts of how analysis gets done or who does it and how it gets done will need to be considered. But the specific language in 9.3 says that the data that you collect in 9.1 and 9.2 and the data that you have from your community needs assessment and all of the other data that you collect is analyzed and it is presented to the board for action, for review or action, at least annually, and that that analysis includes any operational or strategic program adjustments that might be needed for improvement. So this is a very complex standard. It's about analysis of data. It's about preparing suggestions for improvement, and it's about involving the agency's board. And so the intent of this is that the network really needs to be confident that the data that's being collected is not just collected to send in a report to somebody else, but that it's actually used for improvement. And that the agency analyzes its own data in order to make suggestions for improvement, and that the agency board is involved in making these meaningful decisions that we have. It actually, this is embedded in the standard that there is an ability of the agency to analyze the data. In some of my other discussions, I like to ask people to think about what it takes to analyze data, what capacity is needed to analyze the data. And you might think, well, a person needs to be able to do math, or a person needs to be able to read, a person needs to be able to have comparison analysis techniques. You know, I'm going to look at last year's report and next year's report, and I'm going to think about it in some comprehensive way. But there's not any specific requirement about the that somebody needs to be an analyst. You don't need any high-level skills to do this. You just really need to be able to have the capacity to gather and look at your data. So, and then to roll it into a report. And one of the references for this section talks about how you create a report, and I think that's an interesting piece to think about, because the report that you give to the board is to identify suggestions for adjustment and improvement, and to really think about how things could be done better, how they could be done differently. So do you have the capacity to aggregate all this data and process it for review? And do you have a system for the board's review? Is there a board committee? Is there that reviews it first, or does it go to the full board all at once? So there's a real question about how that happens, and then really what the board's involvement is, how they participate. And so when you look at the compliance and the documentation issues, you might have a copy of that report. You might have information that a board pre-meeting packets that say these are the things that are going to be talked about. You know, this is what's going to be on the agenda. Some copies of email exchanges would show that you sent information out to the board. And then always documentation in the board minutes that a review was done and what the suggestions are for action and approval. Some questions. Who does the analysis? Is the board involved in the analysis? How often is the analysis done and this report prepared? The compliance issue is at least once a year. The question is how often is appropriate? And then how do you get this agency-wide analysis, not just program-specific analysis? And then do you include the individual, family, and community outcomes in the context of the agency outcomes? So then we might have made changes in the agency systems, and that produced some changes in outcomes for families or communities. Any questions on this standard so far?
Yeah, we have one question that just came in. Can this review be done at the program level and the program coordinators meet with the board to share what and how changes will be made? I think that's a great question, and I think the answer to that would be whatever is the most efficient and effective system for making recommendations that would work best for your agency. I think making suggestions directly to the board would be great, especially if they're coming from program managers. You could also, after you've gone through all the standards 9.1 through 9.4, you could just potentially get your program managers or appropriate staff together, make a series of recommendations, roll them all up, and submit those to your CEO or your leadership team and the board at the same time. Again, whatever you think would make sure that those recommendations get in front of folks who would be able to act on them and reflect on them. But I think that would be a great suggestion to have those the program staff make some recommendations to the board after having gone through the review process for the standards.
Yeah, I think that it's important to not give the board a lot of data that has not been processed by the staff who knows what that data means much more intimately. Not to say that the board shouldn't get the raw data, that's not what I'm saying, but it's more useful for people who understand what the data says to be able to organize it in a way that makes it meaningful. Because as you know, data is not information. It has to be analyzed before it gets converted to information. And what you want to provide to the board is information that they can use for decision making. So I think the process, you'll have to work out the process, what makes the most sense, as Jarl says, and keep in mind that you want it to be the most accurate, most viable set of information that you can provide that will allow an understanding of the suggestions that are being recommended so that appropriate decision making can happen.
Great. Are there any other questions on 9.3, Cashin?
Not at this point.
I see something about board committees, and I think that's another way to go with this process, is to have an actual committee of the board that's made up of people who are like data wonks. They like to do this kind of information, looking at this kind of information. You might have a committee that does a deeper dive, or that actually works with the program managers before it's submitted to the larger board. So that might be another way to help engage the board in a more viable way with the analysis of the data.
That's a great point, Barbara. And in our sort of PowerPoint discussion, I described to Barbara the standards as really being the tip of the iceberg. And so in this review and evaluation process that again, we suggest agencies go through, the questions to ask are we getting the most out of our data as an agency? And you're not going to answer that question simply by going through and seeing if you're in compliance with the standard and gathering documentation. That is a related set of questions, but again, one that we're encouraging our agencies to be intentional about asking. So I think if you've got a board committee on data, I think that would be a great committee to put that question to. You might submit your documentation to show that you're in compliance with the standards, and then engage that committee in a discussion about recommendations for how the agency could improve all the data that it's gathering on client demographics, on client outcomes. Are you serving the right folks? Are you using the data effectively? Are you getting the most out of that IS data that your agency could possibly get? So again, no matter at what level of the organization you have these discussions, I think the important point is that you do it in a way that's reflective and will get it in front of folks who can then make decisions and act on those recommendations.
Okay. Right, so yeah, let's think about beyond compliance. So this is kind of, I think this is kind of a fun question. Does the agency have a process for tracking the actions that follow the board review? So, okay, so what the standard says is that we track that the board made approval or made comments on the suggestions for improvement, but then what? It's always the next question is the then what question. So what happened? Did the actions that were suggested actually get put in place? And did they make improvements? Was there an improvement because of it? Or did things get worse? And we have to go back to the way we were doing it. So the idea of following the actions and seeing if they were effective, I mean, that's part of the cycle. It's part of the Roma cycle, to review, reassess, to look at how we're going to re-implement, and then look at it again. Is there documentation of reports? Oh yeah, I think that's the same question. There, Barbara, you've written that question twice. So is there documentation of what results of the action that were taken? And then, does the analysis of the outcome data include a relationship with demographics and services? I think that, here again, the language of this standard says that the review is an analysis done of the outcome data, which might make you think that it's only about the data in 9.2. But really, you need to think about the relationship between the data that's in referred to in 9.2 and those that are referred to in 9.1, because it's the relationship between the outcomes, the demographics, and the services that are really going to help you with your analysis of the data. And then the idea of multi-year tracking. Is there analysis of this data over more than 1 year? And then how is the data, does the board refer back to the community needs assessment data? So they see the analysis of the agency data, they got some ideas about what might change, but can they also then refer back to the needs assessment data to say whether or not what's happening is about the is it impacting on those big needs that the agency has identified. It also means that there might be trends, there might be other trends that are happening in the world. You know, has something changed dramatically from, you know, the last time we've done a review of our outcome data? And so to compare not only with the community needs assessment, but also with wider trends that are happening in the community and and across the country. Of these, sorry, go ahead.
We have another question that's come in. Is it the intention for the board to make the decision or for the staff to recommend the changes that will meet the need of the customers? And I think, again, it depends on how you usually handle, you know, making recommendations to the board. If your board prefers to give, you know, general guidance to the agency that then gets, you know, implemented and the details worked out, or whether you typically provide those recommendations to the board, they review them, make any additions, edits, or changes, and then you go ahead and implement them. So I think it would be whatever, you know, system your board typically uses to handle those types of decision-making situations. You know, I think it's probably, as Cashin said earlier, generally a good idea to give you know, very specific information to the board. So when you present that, the outcome data, you might go ahead and also present recommendations on what to do, and then ask the board for feedback, again, to make sure that they're focused in on the particular questions. But I think it's whatever process that your board typically uses to deal with those situations when they're asked to make recommendations or the staff presents recommendations. Barbara, anything to add on that?
Just that in the language, it really does, of the standard, it really does say that that what is presented to the board is the analysis and recommendations. So analysis, the outcomes, and any operational or strategic program adjustments and improvements identified. So it is suggesting that there's some synthesis of the analysis before it goes to the board. I would say that you should refer back to good guidance about the role of a board and the role of staff, and which things are board governance things and which things are staff responsibilities, so that you're not allowing your board to get into the day-to-day implementation activities that are not its function, but that you're keeping them at the policies and procedures level, which are dramatically different and which are definitely in their responsibility level.
I think that's an excellent point, Barbara, there. CSBG and community action does kind of work on that line of a typical, I guess, nonprofit board versus how hands-on the board actually gets, because you are tasked with, being a part of the planning and evaluation and programming. However, you're not supposed to be that far into the weeds. So I think it does, in fact, say that the staff is the one that's responsible for coming to the board. And then I think that we have two different verbs in there to allow some flexibility. We have both for review or action. So as far as how formal the board's role is in that, I think we give some flexibility, because the entire point at the end of the day is that we can prove to anyone that asks, basically, that we do performance management as an agency.
Great. And I think two additional things to add for this particular standard. The first is because this is a standard that requires board review of, a fairly complex set of activities by the agency. This is one to make sure that you're thinking about the overall sequence of when that monitoring is going to happen and when you start this conversation with the board, just to make sure that you give yourself enough time, again, to present those recommendations to the board, get their feedback so you can check this particular standard off, but make sure that happens, ideally before the monitoring visit. And also making sure that you've got that follow-up procedure, again, to act on those recommendations in place. Barbara, anything else to add?
No, but I do think that we just need to understand that the board is the owner of the corporation. They have responsibilities, and the standards throughout, not just this one, not just 9, but all of the categories include a higher focus on board responsibilities and board roles than we have seen spelled out in the past. And so I think that's one of the things that we need to pay particular attention to, is that we're not changing what the expectations are of the board's role. We're just spelling them out more clearly so that everyone is able to respond to them in a standardized way.
Right, and it's a complicated standard, but that doesn't mean that you have to make it a complicated process. I just wanted to kind of remind everybody of that. This is one of those that, honestly, doing it as that kind of once-a-year point-in-time report is probably harder than making sure that this is an ongoing discussion between the staff and the board.
Right, so it might make sense to have quarterly discussions. Or at least maybe every 6 months.
Right. So that rolling discussion, so that you're never caught too late to get it in before you're monitored. Yeah, it's a good point. And that calendar concept is really one that's important for this standard, because you really need to start backing things up to say, this is when I would do it. So if you do it more frequently, you're not in quite so much of a crunch.
And a last clarification for this standard, you do need to present that data to the full board, not a board committee. So if you have a data committee and you have this discussion with the board, you would still need to have that discussion with the board as a whole, because that's the way the standard is written.
That's a very good point. And I thought of that when we were talking about committees, and then my mouth got ahead of my brain and I forgot to say that. Good point, Jarl. That's exactly right. Just having the board committee review it does not meet this, the intent of the standard. Okay, now on this one, I did want to point out about the resources, a couple fun things about these resources. This community toolbox, I picked out the piece of it that I thought was most appropriate to this standard, but this is an excellent tool for a lot of community work. I mean, it's just fun. It talks about assessments and evaluations and all kinds of things. So it's a good site. This one, I thought, I say this all the time, that data is not information, and so I finally found a document that actually agrees with me. It's just a blog, but at least it's it's on the internet, so that makes it right? So, and then this last one is about structuring the report. It's a little high level. It's from Carnegie Mellon University, which is right down the road from me, but it's an interesting approach and something to look at as you're thinking about what that data report might look like to your board. Okay, so then the last one is that the IS data is reported. It's that the data is reported on client demographics and organization-wide outcomes are included. This really thinks about the analysis. I don't think that little note isn't the right note for this one, but it really talks about both the demographics and the outcomes. And so the intent of the standard is to make sure that there's a timely submission of the data report that goes to NASCAS from the state. So this March 31st date it's a state has to submit to NASCAS date. So that means that individual agencies would be given an earlier date by their state office. Some dates are January, some are December, some are earlier, but the idea is that the data then has to be reported from the state office out, so that it needs to be done before that. So this establishes this standardized format about a variety of activities and outcomes, and it ensures that the local agencies can produce accurate data that's reported to the state office. It means that in some other place, it'll mean that the state needs to make sure that they're checking the accuracy of the data. But this standard says that the agencies verify that their data is accurate. Even though there might be different kinds of data collection procedures, as we talked about at the top of the hour on this one, still, once that data gets submitted to the state, it gets submitted in a standardized format to NASCAS, so it's finally standardized. Then I would say that going forward, that there's going to be some changes made to the IS report. It won't change the intention of this standard, because this standard is about, it specifically speaks to the annual IS survey data, but the language might change, but the intent won't change, that there is an annual report that's due. This says that there might be some challenges, and everybody agrees that there are challenges in data collection, but the agency has demonstrated the capacity to collect demographic data and a system for collecting information for all of the sections of the IS and the NPI report, so that there is a system established for that data collection and submission. And so some things to document that there was submission, actual copies of the IS report submission, verification of receipt, some email exchanges regarding submission. So just some key pieces that you want to be able to document that you have submitted in a timely fashion. Then beyond, then here's some other questions to consider. How is the accuracy of the data monitored? Sometimes I'll look at agency data and I'll say, oh, this data can't be accurate because the number of people who achieved an outcome is higher than the number of people who received the service. So is there a simple check of accuracy? And then is there a more detailed check of the accuracy of the data? Does the report include only unduplicated individuals and families, which the directions say it should? And then what's the documentation of community level data, so that you can support your involvement in community outcomes? Some beyond compliance ideas, is there a process to use the data for future actions? To use the data, that's going to be a theme that you'll hear from now for a long time. What is the process to use the information that was in this report? have you compared this information with the community needs assessment data to see, are we making a difference in the identified needs? Do we compare do we have to compare data from prior years to the current year so that we can see trends? So those are all pieces of beyond compliance. And I really don't have any resources for this one because it's really just about submitting the data. And I'll get some IM information from OCS that says that this is a requirement of the contract to put in there, but that's about it. So any thoughts on this standard?
I don't see any questions that have come in yet, but it's not the last opportunity. If you think of any late-breaking ones, do go ahead and type those in while we kind of wrap up how this technical assistance guide will work.
So again, what is up on the screen right now is a picture of the worksheet. So again, this is not something that you have to use. It's just a template that you can adapt for your own purposes. But what you would see if you had very, very good eyesight would simply be the columns with the documentation that you use to show you're in compliance with each standard. Again, a score on that Likert scale that we mentioned. We'll show you a picture of that in a second. And then a column with any actions to be taken. So that would either be actions to become in compliance with the standard or those recommendations that we're suggesting agencies make after they've gone through the documentation process, and then some, just tracking boxes for who's going to be responsible for taking that action and the deadline for that. And Kasia, if we can get the next slide. Again, this is a shot of the draft of that Likert scale. And so what we've done is try to break out compliance across those 5 different boxes. So 1 and 2 would be various states of not being in compliance with the standard. 3 would be if your agency is in compliance with the standard, and 4 and 5 would be advancing and outstanding. So if your agency was not just meeting the standard but was exceeding it. So again, we're encouraging agencies to give themselves a rating on that 1 through 5 point scale. That helps you benchmark where you are. You can track your performance over the out years as you continue to monitor yourself against the standard. And it also helps you prioritize where you might want to do some extra thinking about ways to improve your operations and activities related to the standard. So again, that assessment process, going through doing that evaluation, making the recommendations is a voluntary process, although again, we strongly encourage agencies to consider doing that because we really think that gets the most out of the standards. It makes it not just an exercise in compliance, but a way to engage in continuous improvement of your agency, which we obviously strongly encourage. So Barbara, any concluding comments or suggestions?
No, here's just my email address if anyone wants to ask me any questions. And then here's the information from the team at the partnership.
Great, and we have a quick question. Will the assessment charts be posted somewhere? Yes, again, they'll be included in all of the toolkits, so you'll be able to access those charts and those worksheets inside of every technical assistance guide. The draft of this guide is almost complete. We get these guides up as quickly as possible, so we already have one posted for Category 3 on the community assessment, and we will be posting another several over the next couple of days. So again, this is a very, very busy month here at the partnership with getting these guides up and doing these webinars. So make sure you keep checking back because we do update our webpage with these resources immediately upon completion. So be looking for additional guides to be posted very shortly and also continuing this webinar series through the end of the month. So thank you again for joining us this afternoon. We look forward to hopefully seeing you again. And please don't hesitate to reach out directly to us at the partnership if you have any other questions or if we can support your work in any way. So thanks a lot and hope to see you all again next time.